Covert Action in Chile, 1963 to 1973. Chapter 5. Preliminary Conclusions. Underlying all discussion of American interference in the internal affairs of Chile is the basic question of why the United States initially mounted such an extensive covert action program in Chile, and why it had continued and even expanded in the early 1970s. Covert action has been a key element of U.S. foreign policy towards Chile. The link between covert action and foreign policy was obvious throughout the decade between 1964 and 1974. In 1964, the United States' commitment to democratic reform via the Alliance for Progress and overt foreign aid was buttressed via covert support for the election of the candidate of the Christian Democratic Party, a candidate and a party for which the alliance seemed tailor-made. During 1970, the U.S. government tried, covertly, to prevent Allende from becoming president of Chile. When that failed, covert support to his opposition formed one of a triad of official actions: covert aid to opposition forces, cool but correct diplomatic posture, and economic pressure. From support of what the United States considered to be democratic and progressive forces in Chile, we have moved finally to advocating and encouraging the overthrow of a democratically elected government. A. Covert action and U.S. foreign policy. In 1964, the United States became massively involved in covert activity in Chile. This involvement was seen by U.S. policymakers as consistent with overall American foreign policy and the goals of the Alliance for Progress. The election of a moderate left candidate in Chile was a cornerstone of U.S. policy toward Latin America. It is unclear from the record whether the 1964 election project was intended to be a one-time intervention in support of a good cause. It is clear that the scale of the involvement generated commitments and expectations on both sides. For the United States, it created assets and channels of funding which could be used again. For the Chilean groups receiving CIA funds, that funding became an expectation counted upon. Thus, when opposition to Allende became the primary objective of covert action in 1970, the structure for covert action developed through covert assistance to political parties in 1964 was well established. A fundamental question raised by the pattern of U.S. covert activities persists. Did the threat to vital U.S. national security interest posed by the presidency of Salvador Allende justify the several major covert attempts to prevent his ascension to power? 3 American presidents and their senior advisors evidently thought so. One rationale for covert intervention in Chilean politics was spelled out by Henry Kissinger in his background briefing to the press on September 16, 1970, the day after Nixon's meeting with Helms. He argued that an Allende victory would be irreversible within Chile, might affect neighboring nations, and would pose massive problems for the U.S. in Latin America. Quote, "I have yet to meet somebody who firmly believes that if Allende wins, there is likely to be another free election for Chile. Now, it is fairly easy for one to predict that if Allende wins, there is a good chance that he will establish over a period of years some sort of communist government. In that case, we would have one not of an island of the coast, Cuba, which has not a traditional relationship and impact on Latin America, but in a major Latin American country, you would have a communist government, joining, for example, Argentina, Peru, and Bolivia. So I don't think we should delude ourselves of an Allende takeover, and Chile would not present massive problems for us, and for democratic forces, and for pro-US forces in Latin America, and indeed to the whole Western Hemisphere." End quote. Another rationale for U.S. involvement in the internal affairs of Chile was offered by a high-ranking officer who testified before the committee. He spoke of Chile's position in a worldwide strategic chess game in 1970. In this analogy, Portugal might be a bishop, Chile a couple of pawns, perhaps more. In the worldwide strategic chess game, once a position was lost, a series of consequences followed. U.S. enemies would proceed to exploit the new opportunity, and our ability to cope with the challenge would be limited by any American loss. B. Executive command and control of major covert action. In pursuing the Chilean chess game, particularly the efforts to prevent Allende's ascension to power or his maintaining power once elected, executive command and control of major covert action was tight and well directed. Procedures within the CIA for controlling the programs were well defined, and the procedures made station officials accountable to their supervisors in Washington. Unilateral actions on the part of the stations were virtually impossible. But the central issue of command and control is accountability. Procedures for ensuring that covert actions are and remain accountable both to the senior political and foreign policy officials of the executive branch and to the Congress. The record of covert activities in Chile suggests that, although established executive processes of authorization and control were generally adhered to, there were, and remain, genuine shortcomings to these processes. Decisions about which covert action projects are submitted to the 40 Committee were and are made within the CIA on the basis of the agency's determination of the political sensitivity of a project. The form in which covert action projects were cleared with ambassadors and other State Department officials varied. It depended, and still depends, on how interested ambassadors are and how forthcoming their station chiefs are. Once major projects are approved by the 40 Committee, they often continue without searching re-examination by the committee. The agency conducts annual reviews of ongoing projects, but the 40 Committee does not undertake a review unless a project is recommended for renewal, or there is some important change in content or amount. There is also the problem of controlling clandestine projects not labeled covert action. Clandestine collection of human intelligence is not the subject of 40 Committee review, but those projects may be just as politically sensitive as a covert action. Witness U.S. contacts with the Chilean military during 1970 to 1973. Similarly, for security reasons, ambassadors generally know CIA assets only by general description, not by name. That practice may be acceptable, provided the description is detailed enough to inform the ambassador of the risk posed by the development of a particular asset and to allow the ambassador to decide whether or not that asset should be used. There remains the question of the dangers which arise when the very mechanisms established by the executive branch of ensuring internal accountability are circumvented or frustrated. By presidential instruction, Track 2 was to be operated without informing the U.S. ambassador in Santiago, the State Department, or any 40 Committee member save Henry Kissinger. The president and his senior advisors thus denied themselves the government's major sources of counsel about Chilean politics, and the ambassador in Santiago was left in the position of having to deal with any adverse political spillover from a project of which he was not informed. The danger was greater still. Whatever the truth about communication between CIA and the White House after October 15, 1970, an issue which is the subject of conflicting testimony, all participants agreed that Track 2 constituted a broad mandate to the CIA. The agency was given to believe it had virtual carte blanche authority. Moreover, it fell under extreme pressure to prevent Allende from coming to power, by military coup if necessary. It was given little guidance about what subsequent clearances it needed to obtain from the White House. Under these conditions, CIA consultation with the White House in advance of specific actions was less than meticulous. C. The role of Congress. In the hand of Congress rests the responsibility for ensuring that the executive branch is held to full political accountability for covert activities. The record on Chile is mixed and muted by its incompleteness. CIA records note a number of briefings of congressional committees about covert action in Chile. Those records, however, do not reveal the timelines or the level of detail of these briefings. Indeed, the records suggest that the briefings were often after the fact and incomplete. The situation improved after 1973. A apparently as congressional committees became more persistent in the exercise of their oversight function. Furthermore, Section 662 of the Foreign Assistance Act should make it impossible for major projects to be operated without the appropriate congressional committees being informed. The record leaves unanswered a number of questions. These pertain both to how forthcoming the agency was and how interested and persistent the congressional committees were. Were members of Congress, for instance, given the opportunity to object to specific projects before the projects were implemented? Did they want to? There is also an issue of jurisdiction. CIA and State Department officials have taken the position that they are authorized to reveal agency operations only to the appropriate oversight committees. D. Intelligent judgments and covert operations. A review of the intelligent judgments on Chile offered by U.S. analysts during the critical period from 1970 to 1973 has not established whether these judgments were taken into account when U.S. policymakers formulated and approved U.S. covert operations. This examination of the relevant intelligence estimates and memoranda has established that the judgment of the analyst suggested caution and restraint, while the political imperatives demanded action. Even within the Central Intelligence Agency, processes from being considered judgments of intelligence analysts to bear on proposed covert action were haphazard and generally ineffective. This situation has improved. Covert action proposals now regularly come before the Deputy Director for Intelligence and the appropriate National Intelligence Officer. But the operators still are separated from the intelligent analyst, those whose exclusive business it is to understand and predict foreign politics. For instance, the analysts who draft the government's most prestigious intelligence analysis, NIEs, may not even have known of U.S. covert actions in Chile. The Chilean experience does suggest that the committee gives serious consideration to the possibility that lodging the responsibility for national estimates and conduct of operational activities with the same person, the Director of Central Intelligence, creates an inherent conflict of interest and judgment. F. Effects of major covert action programs. Covert action programs, as costly and as complex as several mounted by the United States in Chile, are unlikely to remain covert. In Chile in 1964, there was simply too much unexplained money, too many left-eds, too many broadcasts. That the United States was involved in the election has been taken for granted in Latin America for many years. The involvement in 1964 created a presumption in Chile and elsewhere in Latin America that the United States government would again be involved in 1970. This made secrecy still harder to maintain, even though the CIA involvement was much smaller in 1970 than it had been in 1964. When covert actions in Chile became public knowledge, the costs were obvious. The United States was seen, by its covert actions, to have contradicted not only its official declarations, but its treaty commitments and principles of long standing. At the same time, it was proclaiming a low profile in Latin American relations. The U.S. government was seeking to foment a coup in Chile. The cost of major covert ventures which are blown are clear enough. But there may be costs to pay even if the operations could remain secret for long periods of time. Some of these costs may accrue even with the calculus of covert operations. Successes may turn to failures. Several officials from whom the committee took testimony suggested that the poor showing of the Chilean Christian Democrats in 1970 was, in some part, attributable to previous American covert support. Of course, there were many causes of that poor showing, but in 1964 the PDC had been spared the need of developing some of its own grassroots organization. The CIA did much of that for it. In 1970, with less CIA activity on behalf of the Christian Democratic Party, the PDC flattered. Of course, the more important costs, even for covert actions which remain secret, are those to American ideals of relation among nations and of constitutional government. In the case of Chile, Some of those causes were far from abstract. Witness the involvement of United States military officers in the Track 2 attempt to overthrow a constitutionally elected civilian government. There are also long-term effects of covert actions. Many of those may be adverse. They touch American as well as foreign institutions. The Chilean institutions that the United States most favored may have been discredited within their own societies by the fact of their covert support. In Latin America particularly, even the suspicion of CIA support may be the kiss of death. It would be the final irony of a decade of covert action in Chile if that action destroyed the credibility of the Chilean Christian Democrats. The effects on American institutions are less obvious, but not less important. U.S. private and governmental institutions with overt, legitimate purposes of their own may have been discredited by the pervasiveness of covert action. Even if particular institutions were not involved in covert action, they may have been corrupted in the perceptions of Latin Americans because of the pervasiveness of clandestine U.S. activity. In the end, the whole of U.S. policymaking may be affected. The availability of an extra means may alter officials' assessment of the cost and rationales of overt policies. It may postpone the day when outmoded policies are abandoned and new ones adopted. Arguably, the 1964 election project was part of a progressive approach to Chile. The project was justified, if perhaps not actually sustained, by the desire to elect democratic reformers. By 1970, covert action had become completely defensive in character, to prevent the election of Allende. The United States professed a low profile, but at the same time acted covertly to ensure that the Chilean elections came out right, low profile notwithstanding. A special case for concern is the relationship between intelligence agencies and multinational corporations. In 1970, U.S. government policy prohibited covert CIA support to a single party or candidate. At the same time, the CIA provided advice to an American-based multinational corporation on how to furnish just such direct support. That raised all of the dangers of exposure and eliminated many of the safeguards and control normally present in exclusively CIA covert operations. There was the appearance of an improperly close relationship between the CIA and multinational companies when former director John McCone used contacts and information gained while at the CIA to advise a corporation on whose board of directors he sat. This appearance was heightened because the contacts between the agency and the corporation in 1970 extended to discussing and even planning corporate intervention in the Chilean electoral process. The problem of cooperation is exacerbated when a cooperating company, such as ITT, is called to give testimony before an appropriate congressional committee. The agency may then be confronted with the question of whether to come forward to set the record straight when it believes that testimony given on behalf of a cooperating company is untrue. The situation is difficult, for in coming forward the agency may reveal sensitive sources and methods by which it learned the facts or may make public the existence of ongoing covert operations. This report does not attempt to offer a final judgment on the political property, the morality, or even the effectiveness of American covert activity in Chile. Did the threat posed by an Allende presidency justify covert American involvement in Chile? Did it justify the specific and unusual attempt to foment a military coup to deny Allende the presidency? In 1970, the U.S. sought to foster a military coup in Chile to prevent Allende's ascension to power. Yet after 1970, the government, according to the testimony of its officials, did not engage in coup plotting. Was 1970 a mistake, an aberration? Or was the threat posed to the national security interest of the United States so grave that the government was remiss in not seeking his downfall directly during 1970 to 1973? What responsibility does the United States bear for the cruelty and political suppression that have become the hallmark of the present regime in Chile? On these questions, committee members may differ. so may American citizens. Yet, the committee's mandate is less to judge the past than to recommend for the future. Moving from past cases to future guidelines, what is important to note is that covert action has been perceived as a middle ground between diplomatic representation and the overt use of military force. In the case of Chile, that middle ground may have been far too broad. Given the cost of covert action, it should be resorted to only to counter severe threats to the national security of the United States. It is far from clear that that was the case in Chile.